The blue glow of the television screen flickered across General Dmitri Volkov's face in the darkness of his Moscow office. January 24th, 1991. It was 03:17 in the morning. Outside, a brutal winter wind rattled the reinforced windows of the GRU headquarters building. But inside this room, tucked deep within the fortified complex, the temperature felt tropical. Volkov's shirt collar was damp with sweat. On the screen, an American CNN reporter stood in front of a wall of monitors, his voice tinny through the Soviet-made speakers. Behind him, green night vision footage played on a loop, and in that footage, something was burning. Not just burning, exploding. Volkov's hands, calloused from decades of climbing in and out of tanks, gripped the armrests of his leather chair. His knuckles were white. He had spent his entire adult life with one singular purpose: to perfect the Soviet armored doctrine, to build an unstoppable steel fist that could crush NATO in a matter of hours. The T-72 tank was his baby. Not literally, of course. He had not designed it. But he had refined it. He had tested it. He had written the tactical manuals. He had trained the officers. He had stood in the Politburo and sworn on his life that this machine, this masterpiece of Soviet engineering, was the answer to anything the Americans could field. And now, on this screen, broadcast to the entire world by the American propaganda machine CNN, his baby was dying, one after another, in the dark, from distances that should have been impossible. The footage switched. A thermal camera view from an American aircraft. In the ghostly white and black world of heat signatures, Volkov could see them clearly. A column of Iraqi T-72 tanks. They were moving information exactly as Soviet doctrine dictated. Spacing correct, speed appropriate, defensive posture maintained. Then, a brilliant white flash. The lead tank erupted, not a fire, an explosion. The turret, that massive 12-ton steel dome, lifted off the hull like a bottle cap and spiraled into the air. Before it even hit the ground, the second tank was struck. Then the third. The American reporter was speaking, but Volkov was not listening to the words. He was counting. 7 seconds. 7 seconds from the first impact to the destruction of 4 T-72 tanks. 4 crews, 16 men. Gone. Erased. And the American machine that had killed them was not even visible in the footage. It was somewhere out there in the black desert night, hunting. Volkov reached for the crystal glass on his desk. Vodka. He drained it in one motion and immediately refilled it from the bottle he kept in his drawer. His throat burned, but it was a familiar burn. A Russian burn. A burn that reminded him he was still alive. The men on that screen were not. He turned off the television. The sudden darkness felt like a physical weight. For a moment, he sat in silence, listening to his own breathing. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the steel door. Volkov did not need to ask who it was. Only one person knocked at this hour. Enter. The door opened, and Captain Yuri Lebedev stepped inside. He was young, 26, maybe 27, a GRU intelligence analyst assigned to Volkov's staff. His face was pale, and in his hands he carried a red folder. Red meant classified. Red meant urgent. Red meant something had gone very, very wrong. "Comrade General," Lebedev said, his voice tight. "The latest assessment from Baghdad." Volkov gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit, and stop looking like you are about to be shot. If anyone is getting shot tonight, it is not you." Lebedev sat. He placed the folder on the desk and slid it across. Volkov opened it. Inside were satellite photographs, typed reports, and hand-drawn tactical diagrams. The first photograph showed a stretch of desert highway. The second photograph showed the same highway, but now it was a graveyard. Burned out T-72 hulls, overturned BMP infantry fighting vehicles, shattered supply trucks. The entire column had been destroyed, not scattered, not routed, annihilated. How many? Volkov asked. 42 tanks, Lebedev replied. Estimated time of engagement, 11 minutes. 11 minutes. 42 tanks. Volkov did the math in his head. One tank destroyed every 15 seconds, for 11 straight minutes. He looked up at the captain. What did this? American Ground Forces, Comrade General. M1 Abrams tanks, supported by A-10 Thunderbolt attack aircraft and AH-64 Apache helicopters. Volkov leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. He had heard of the Abrams, of course. The intelligence reports had been coming in for years. A gas turbine engine, composite armor, a 120 mm smoothbore gun. On paper, it was impressive. But paper was not the battlefield. The T-72 had proven itself in Afghanistan, in Angola, in the Golan Heights. It was a proven warrior. The Abrams was an untested American experiment. A showpiece. A parade tank. 11 minutes, Volkov repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it make sense. Yes, Comrade General. And the Iraqi crews? They followed Soviet doctrine to the letter. Defensive formation, overlapping fields of fire, anti-aircraft coverage. Then how? Lebedev hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost apologetic. The Americans can see in the dark, Comrade General. Their thermal optics. Our intelligence indicates they engaged from ranges exceeding 2,500 meters. The Iraqi crews never even saw them. They were blind. Blind. That word hit Volkov like a fist to the stomach. A tank crew that could not see was not a crew. It was a coffin. He flipped through the photographs again. In one image, he could see the impact point on a T-72's turret. A clean, precise hole. No scorch marks, no explosive splash, just a hole. The penetrator had gone through the armor like it was cardboard. He thought of the men inside. The loader standing next to the autoloader carousel. The gunner hunched over, his primitive optical sight. The commander scanning the horizon with binoculars. The driver sealed in his compartment. When that round hit, the interior of the tank would have become a furnace. The crew would have been incinerated instantly, if they were lucky. Volkov closed the folder. What is the total count? As of 200 hours Moscow time, the coalition forces have destroyed an estimated 847 Iraqi tanks. Of those, 612 are confirmed T-72 variants. 847 tanks in less than a week. Volkov had trained some of those Iraqi officers himself. Back in 1985, when Saddam Hussein was still a Soviet client. They had been good men, disciplined, professional. They had learned the doctrine, they had learned the tactics, and now they were dead, all of them. Because the Americans had changed the rules of the game, and no one in Moscow had seen it coming. Captain, Volkov said slowly, in your assessment, what is the single greatest advantage the Americans possess? Lebedev did not hesitate. Night vision, Comrade General. The M1 Abrams, the A-10, the Apache, they all carry thermal imaging systems. They can identify and engage targets in complete darkness, in sandstorms, in smoke. Our T-72 crews are fighting with equipment designed in the 1960s. They have no thermal sights, no laser rangefinders, no computerized fire control. They are aiming with their eyes, Comrade General, and the Americans are aiming with machines. Machines. That was the word that gnawed at Volkov's mind. The Soviets had always prided themselves on the human element. The tank was a tool, yes, but it was the crew that made it deadly. Soviet crews were trained to fight through pain, through fear, through chaos. They were warriors. But in the desert, in the dark, warrior spirit meant nothing. You could not shoot what you could not see, and you could not survive an enemy that saw you perfectly. Volkov stood and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, Moscow was a sea of yellow lights and black shadows. Somewhere out there, in the Kremlin, the leadership was watching the same reports. They were asking the same questions, and they were looking for answers, for someone to blame. He turned back to Lebedev. The A-10 aircraft. Tell me about it. The captain opened his briefcase and pulled out another folder. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, American close air support aircraft. NATO reporting name, Warthog. It is built around a single weapon, the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm rotary cannon. The cannon fires depleted uranium rounds capable of penetrating the top armor of a T-72 at ranges up to 1,200 meters. Depleted uranium. Yes, Comrade General. The rounds are 3 times denser than steel. When they strike armor, they do not mushroom. They penetrate, and they ignite. The interior of the tank burns. Volkov's jaw tightened. Depleted uranium. The Americans were using radioactive waste as ammunition. It was brilliant. It was horrifying. It was effective. He thought of the A-10's distinctive profile. Twin engines mounted high on the fuselage. Straight wings, a nose that looked like a shark's mouth painted on the front. It was not a beautiful aircraft. But beauty was not the point. Lethality was. And the Apache helicopter? H-64 Apache. Twin-engine attack helicopter. Primary armament, AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. Laser-guided. Range 8,000 meters. The Hellfire uses a tandem warhead specifically designed to defeat reactive armor. It punches through the outer layer, then detonates inside the tank. 8,000 meters. That was nearly 5 miles. A T-72's main gun had an effective range of 2,000 meters on a good day. The Americans were killing Soviet-designed tanks from distances where the tanks could not even fight back. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Volkov returned to his desk and sat down heavily. He poured another vodka but did not drink it. He just stared at the glass. "Captain," he said quietly, "do you know what I told the Politburo in 1987? "No, Comrade General." "I told them that the T-72 was the finest main battle tank in the world. I told them that in a war with NATO, our armored divisions would reach the Rhine in 72 hours. I told them that the Americans were soft, that their soldiers were undisciplined, that their equipment was over-engineered and fragile." He picked up the glass and drank. I believed every word. Lebedev said nothing. What could he say? The evidence was in the photographs, in the kill ratios, in the smoking wreckage scattered across the Iraqi desert. The Soviet doctrine, the doctrine Volkov had helped build, was obsolete. Worse than obsolete. It was suicide. "There is something else, Comrade General," Lebedev said carefully. "More good news? The Americans are coordinating their attacks in real time. Their tanks, their aircraft, their helicopters, they are all linked by radio and computer networks. They share targeting data instantaneously. When an M1 Abrams identifies a target, it can transmit the coordinates to an Apache 5 kilometers away. The Apache fires. The tank moves to the next target. It is a system, Comrade General, not individual units. A system. A system. Volkov felt a cold, creeping dread settle over him. The Americans had not just built better tanks or better aircraft. They had built a better way of fighting. They had turned the battlefield into a network, a web of sensors and shooters all working together. The Soviets, with their rigid command structures and their fear of independent action, had nothing like it. A Soviet tank commander could not call in an airstrike. A Soviet helicopter pilot could not coordinate with ground forces in real time. The doctrine did not allow it. The technology did not support it. "Captain," Volkov said, "I want you to do something for me." "Anything, Comrade General." "I want you to compile a full technical comparison. The M1 Abrams versus the T-72. Every specification, armor, firepower, optics, fire control, mobility, everything. And I want you to include the American doctrine, how they train, how they fight, how they think." "Yes, Comrade General. When do you need it?" "Yesterday." Lebedev stood, gathered his folders, and saluted. Volkov returned the salute, and the captain left. The door closed, and Volkov was alone again. He looked at the red folder on his desk. Inside were the photographs of dead men in dead tanks. Men who had trusted the doctrine. Men who had believed, as Volkov had believed, that Soviet steel and Soviet spirit were enough. But the desert had taught a different lesson. The desert had taught that in modern war, the side that sees first, shoots first, and kills first wins. And the Americans, with their thermal sights and their networked systems and their precision weapons, could see everything. The Soviets, with their doctrine written in the 1950s and their equipment built in the 1960s, were blind. Volkov turned the television back on. CNN was still broadcasting. The same footage, the same burning tanks, the same voice of the American reporter, confident and clinical, describing the destruction of an army. An army built on Soviet principles. An army that looked exactly like the Red Army. And somewhere in the Kremlin, someone was watching this too. Someone was asking the same question Volkov was asking. If the Americans could do this to the Iraqis, what could they do to us? The answer, Volkov realized, was already written in the flames on the screen. They could do whatever they wanted. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing the Red Army could do to stop them, not anymore. Not with the doctrine they had, not with the equipment they had. The balance of power had shifted. And Volkov, who had spent 40 years building the Soviet armored might, had just watched it become irrelevant in a matter of days. He thought about the young tank commanders he had trained. Boys, really. 18, 19, 20 years old. Conscripts from Siberia and the Ukraine and the Caucasus. If war came tomorrow, they would climb into their T-72 tanks, and they would follow the doctrine, and they would die. Just like the Iraqis. Blind, burning, forgotten. But what haunted Volkov most was not the deaths. It was the certainty, the absolute crushing certainty that this was not a fluke. This was not bad luck. This was the future, and the future belonged to the Americans. The conference room on the 4th floor of the GRU headquarters was thick with cigarette smoke. It was February 26, 1991. 7 days since the American-led coalition had launched its ground offensive into Iraq and Kuwait. 7 days since the world had watched the Red Army's doctrine die on live television. The long oak table was surrounded by 12 men, all generals, all veterans of the Soviet armored forces. At the head of the table sat Marshal Grigory Yazov, the Minister of Defense himself. His face was granite. His uniform was immaculate. His eyes were cold. Volkov sat midway down the table, his folder of reports open in front of him. He had not slept in 3 days. His uniform smelled of stale vodka and sweat. But his mind was sharp. He had to be sharp, because today, in this room, he was going to have to defend the indefensible. "Gentlemen," Yazov began, his voice a low growl, "we are here to discuss the situation in Iraq. And before anyone speaks, let me be clear. What we discuss in this room does not leave this room. The Politburo is watching. The Americans are listening. And our own people are starting to ask questions we cannot afford to answer. He lit a cigarette. So, let us begin with the facts. General Volkov, you have been monitoring the performance of the T-72 in combat. Give us your assessment. Volkov stood. Every eye in the room turned to him. He cleared his throat. Comrades, the situation in Iraq is complex. The Iraqi forces, equipped primarily with T-72 tanks, T-62 tanks, and T-55 tanks, have suffered significant losses. However, we must consider the context. The Iraqi crews were poorly trained. Their maintenance was inadequate. Their tactics were defensive and static. This is not a fair representation of Soviet doctrine, as it would be executed by the Red Army. Numbers, Yazov said flatly. Give me numbers. Volkov glanced at his notes. As of 0600 hours this morning, coalition forces have destroyed approximately 3,700 Iraqi armored vehicles. This includes tanks, armored personnel carriers, and self-propelled artillery. Of the tanks, an estimated 2,000 are T-72 variants. The room was silent. The general near the end of the table, a man named Kozlov, leaned forward. 2,000 T-72 tanks? In 7 days? Yes, Comrade General. And American losses? Volkov hesitated. This was the number that haunted him. 18 M1 Abrams tanks have been reported damaged. 9 are total losses. None were destroyed by enemy tank fire. The silence deepened. Someone coughed. Another general muttered something under his breath. Kozlov's face turned red. You are telling me that the Americans have lost 9 tanks in a week of combat? 9. Yes. And how many of those 9 were destroyed by T-72 tanks? None, Comrade General. The American losses were caused by friendly fire, landmines, and mechanical failures. Kozlov slammed his fist on the table. This is impossible. The T-72 is a proven weapon. The 125mm gun can penetrate any NATO armor at combat ranges. The autoloader gives us a rate of fire advantage. This does not make sense. Volkov remained standing. He had expected this. Kozlov was old school. He had commanded a tank regiment in East Germany for 20 years. He believed in the doctrine the way priests believed in God. Comrade General, the issue is not the gun. The T-72's 125mm cannon is capable of defeating the M1 Abrams at ranges under 1,500 meters. The problem is the optics. The Iraqi crews could not see the Americans. The M1 Abrams is equipped with thermal imaging sights. They can identify and engage targets in complete darkness, through sandstorms, through smoke. The Americans were engaging T-72 tanks at ranges exceeding 2,500 meters. The Iraqi gunners were using optical sights designed in the 1960s. They could not even acquire a target. Then the Iraqis are cowards, Kozlov barked. A real Soviet crew would close the distance. A real Soviet crew would charge. Charge into what? Volkov shot back. Comrade, I have watched the footage. I have read the after-action reports. The Iraqi T-72 crews did not run. They fought. They died in their tanks. They burned alive because they could not see the enemy. This has nothing to do with courage. It has everything to do with technology. Marshal Yazov raised a hand. The room fell silent. General Volkov, you mentioned the American thermal sights. Explain. Volkov nodded. The M1 Abrams is equipped with a thermal imaging system built by an American company called Hughes Aircraft. It detects infrared radiation, heat. In the desert, where the temperature drops at night, a T-72's engine block glows like a beacon. The American gunner sees a bright white target on a black background. He aims with a laser rangefinder. The fire control computer calculates the ballistics. He fires. The target dies. All of this happens in less than 8 seconds. And our tanks? Our T-72 tanks use a coincidence rangefinder and an optical sight. The gunner must manually estimate the range. He must manually adjust for wind. He must manually track the target. If it is dark, if there is dust, if there is smoke, he is blind. A younger General Petrov spoke up. What about our night vision equipment? The TPN-3 night sight? Volkov grimaced. The TPN-3 is an active infrared system. It projects an infrared beam, and the gunner sees the reflection. It has an effective range of 800 meters. The Americans can detect the infrared beam from 5 kilometers away. Using the TPN-3 against an M1 Abrams is like lighting a flare and shouting, "Here I am, please kill me." The room erupted. Generals shouted over each other. Kozlov was on his feet, his face purple with rage. Petrov was shaking his head. Another general, a tank corps commander from the Ukraine, was demanding to see the evidence. Yazov let them argue for exactly 30 seconds. Then he stood. The room went silent. "Enough," Yazov said. "Volkov, continue." Volkov took a breath. "Comrades, the issue is not just the tanks. It is the American doctrine. They are fighting a different kind of war. Their tanks, their aircraft, their helicopters, they all work together. They call it combined arms. But it is more than that. It is a network. An M1 Abrams identifies a target. It radios the coordinates to an AH-64 Apache helicopter. The Apache is 5 kilometers away, hovering behind a ridge. It fires an AGM-114 Hellfire missile. The missile is laser-guided. It hits the target. The tank is destroyed. The M1 Abrams never even fires its gun. It just moves to the next target. You are saying, Yazov said slowly, that the Americans are coordinating their attacks in real time, across different platforms? Yes, Comrade Marshal. And not just coordinating. They are sharing data. The Apache's targeting system can talk to the Abrams fire control computer. The A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft can receive target coordinates from ground forces. Everything is linked. Radio, computers, satellites. It is a system. One of the generals, an air defense specialist, leaned forward. What about the A-10? Our intelligence said it was obsolete, slow, vulnerable. It is slow, Volkov admitted. But in Iraq, speed does not matter. The Iraqi Air Force was destroyed in the first 48 hours. The A-10 operates in uncontested airspace. It flies low. It hunts. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon fires depleted uranium rounds, 7-barrel rotary cannon. Rate of fire, 3,900 rounds per minute. Each round weighs 1 pound. When it hits the top armor of a T-72, it penetrates. The crew is incinerated. Depleted uranium? Petrov asked, his voice quiet. Yes. The Americans are using waste from their nuclear program as ammunition. It is denser than steel. It burns at 3,000 degrees Celsius. The room fell silent again. Volkov could see the realization spreading across their faces. This was not a battle between Soviet tanks and American tanks. This was a battle between two entirely different philosophies of war. The Soviets had built their doctrine en masse. Thousands of T-72 tanks rolling across the Fulda Gap, overwhelming NATO through sheer numbers. The Americans had built their doctrine on precision. 1 M1 Abrams, 1 Apache, 1 A-10, killing targets from distances where retaliation was impossible. Yazov stubbed out his cigarette. What about the highway of death? Volkov's stomach twisted. The highway of death, Route 80, the road from Kuwait City to Basra. He had seen the photographs that morning. He wished he hadn't. Comrade Marshal, on the night of February 26th and 27th, Iraqi forces attempted to retreat from Kuwait City. They formed a convoy on Highway 80. The convoy consisted of military vehicles, civilian vehicles, tanks, trucks, buses, an estimated 2,000 vehicles. The Americans attacked with aircraft, A-10 Thunderbolts, F-15E Strike Eagles, AH-64 Apaches. They destroyed the lead vehicles. Then they destroyed the rear vehicles. The convoy was trapped. For 6 hours, the Americans bombed and strafed the highway. Nothing survived. Casualties? Unknown. The Americans are calling it a military target. But the photographs? Volkov paused. He could still see the images in his mind. Burned bodies, melted steel, a traffic jam of death that stretched for miles. The photographs show a massacre. Kozlov was pale now. How many tanks were in the convoy? Approximately 400. Most were T-72 tanks and T-55 tanks. They were destroyed in place. The Americans did not even stop to verify the kills. They just kept firing until nothing moved. Marshal Yazov stood and walked to the window. Outside, Moscow stretched into the gray winter afternoon. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "General Volkov, in your professional opinion, if the Red Army were to face the Americans tomorrow, with the equipment and doctrine we have today, what would be the outcome?" This was the question. The question Volkov had been dreading. The question that would define the rest of his life. He thought of the young conscripts in their T-72 tanks. He thought of the training exercises he had supervised. He thought of the doctrine he had written. He thought of the 40 years he had spent building the Soviet armored might. And then he thought of the burning wrecks on Highway 80, the blinded Iraqi crews, the thermal sights that turned night into day, the Hellfire missiles striking from kilometers away, the depleted uranium rounds punching through steel like paper. "Comrade Marshal," Volkov said, his voice steady, "we would lose." The room exploded. Generals shouted. Kozlov called him a traitor. Petrov demanded he retract the statement. But Yazov raised his hand again, and the room fell silent. The marshal turned from the window. His face was unreadable. "Explain." Volkov met his gaze. "We built our doctrine on the assumption that our tanks were equal to NATO tanks. We built our strategy on mass and speed. We trained our crews to fight at close range, to maneuver, to use terrain. But the Americans have changed the battlefield. They can see us before we see them. They can kill us from ranges where our guns are useless. Our doctrine is obsolete. Our equipment is outdated. And unless we rebuild everything from the ground up, we will lose." Yazov nodded slowly. "How long would it take to rebuild?" 10 years, maybe 15. We would need new thermal sights, new fire control computers, new training programs, new doctrine, new everything. "We do not have 10 years, Yazov said quietly. "We may not have 10 months. He was right. Volkov knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The economy was in ruins. The republics were breaking away. There was no money for new tanks. No money for new technology. No money for anything except trying to hold the empire together for one more day. "Gentlemen," Yazov said, "this meeting is over. You will return to your commands. You will not discuss what was said here. Not with your subordinates. Not with your families. Not with anyone. The Red Army is still the greatest military force in the world. And that is what the Politburo will hear. Am I understood?" The generals nodded. They stood. They filed out of the room. Volkov was the last to leave. As he reached the door, Yazov called his name. "Dmitri." Volkov turned. The marshal was still standing by the window, backlit by the gray Moscow light. "Yes, Comrade Marshal. You were right to tell the truth. But truth does not win wars. Technology does." Volkov nodded. He left the room. The door closed behind him. In the hallway, He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He thought of all the reports still to come, all the photographs, all the statistics. The war in Iraq would be over soon. The Americans would declare victory. And the Soviet Union, the empire that had defeated Nazi Germany, the superpower that had held the West at bay for 50 years, would be forced to admit a terrible, irreversible fact. The balance of power had shifted, and there was nothing they could do about it. If you have ever wondered how a superpower realizes it has lost the race, this is how. Not with a declaration, not with a surrender, but with a quiet meeting in a smoke-filled room where old men stare at numbers that cannot be denied. March 3rd, 1991. The war was over. CNN had declared it. The White House had declared it. The Pentagon had held a press conference showing footage of American soldiers waving flags in Kuwait City. In Iraq, the fires still burned. In Moscow, the silence was deafening. Volkov sat alone in his office. The television was off. The red folders were stacked in a neat pile on his desk. He had read them all. Every report, every photograph, every statistic. The final numbers were in. The Americans had achieved what military historians would later call the most lopsided victory in modern warfare. In 100 hours of ground combat, coalition forces had destroyed over 4,000 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles. American tank losses: 9 M1 Abrams, none to enemy fire. The kill ratio was not just favorable, it was apocalyptic. It was something like 400 to 0. But Volkov was not thinking about ratios. He was thinking about a training exercise he had supervised in 1983. A young lieutenant, barely 22 years old, had asked him a question. "Comrade General, what happens if we face an enemy we cannot see?" Volkov had laughed. He had told the boy that Soviet thermal technology was under development. He had told him that Soviet doctrine emphasized maneuver and aggression, not hiding. He had told him that only cowards fight from the shadows. The lieutenant had nodded and never asked again. Volkov wondered if that lieutenant was still alive, wondered if he was commanding a T-72 somewhere, wondered if he remembered that conversation. The knock on the door was soft this time. Captain Lebedev entered without waiting for permission. His face was grim. "Comrade General, there is something you need to see." "More photographs?" "No. Video? American military footage. Declassified." Volkov gestured to the television. Lebedev inserted a VHS tape into the player and pressed play. The screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, shot from a thermal camera mounted on an American helicopter. An AH-64 Apache, Volkov guessed. The view was from above, looking down at a stretch of desert highway. In the thermal image, everything was shades of gray and white. And scattered across the highway, glowing like embers, were the heat signatures of Iraqi vehicles. Tanks, trucks, personnel carriers. The Apache's targeting reticle moved across the screen, settling on a T-72 tank. The tank was stationary. Its engine was running. The crew was inside, Volkov knew, probably listening to the radio, probably waiting for orders that would never come. The reticle locked. A small text overlay appeared. "Hellfire 1, away." 2 seconds later, the T-72 erupted. The thermal bloom was so bright it whited out the camera for a moment. When the image cleared, the tank was a burning wreck. The reticle moved to the next target. "Hellfire 2, away." Another tank died. Then another. Then another. The Apache never moved. It just hovered, invisible in the night sky, and killed. Volkov watched 23 Iraqi tanks die in 6 minutes. The footage ended. The screen went black. "That," Lebedev said quietly, "is what the Americans call target practice." Volkov said nothing. He just stared at the black screen. In his mind, he could see the faces of the Iraqi crews. Young men, like the lieutenant from 1983. Men who had followed the doctrine. Men who had trusted their equipment. Men who had died without ever seeing their killer. He thought about what Marshal Yazov had said. Truth does not win wars. Technology does. But it was more than technology. It was philosophy. The Soviets had built a military designed to win World War II. Waves of tanks, human courage, steel, and grit. The Americans had built a military designed to win a war that had not been fought yet. A war where information was as deadly as ammunition. Where seeing the enemy was more important than shooting at them. Where a single platform, networked to a dozen others, could kill an entire battalion without breaking a sweat. "Captain," Volkov said, "how old are you?" Lebedev blinked. 27, Comrade General. You will live to see a very different Red Army, or perhaps no Red Army at all. Comrade General? Volkov stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Moscow skyline was gray and cold. Somewhere in the Kremlin, the Politburo was meeting. Somewhere in the General Staff, officers were rewriting war plans. Somewhere in the tank factories, workers were building T-72s that were already obsolete. The Americans did not just defeat Iraq, Captain. They defeated us. They defeated the entire Soviet way of war. Every assumption, every doctrine, every piece of equipment. They proved that we have been preparing for the wrong war for 50 years. But we have nuclear weapons, Lebedev said, his voice desperate. We have strategic forces. We have nothing. Volkov interrupted. Nuclear weapons are a deterrent. They prevent war. But if war comes, if the tanks roll and the aircraft fly, we lose, completely. The Americans will see us in the dark. They will kill us from ranges where we cannot shoot back. They will coordinate their attacks faster than we can react. And when the smoke clears, there will be nothing left but burning wrecks and dead boys. Lebedev was silent. Volkov turned from the window. Do you know what keeps me awake at night, Captain? It is not the defeat in Iraq. It is the knowledge that I helped build this. I wrote the manuals. I trained the officers. I stood in front of the Politburo and swore that the T-72 was invincible. I believed it. God help me, I believed every word. You could not have known. I should have known. Volkov's voice cracked. He took a breath, steadying himself. I should have asked the hard questions. I should have looked at the American programs and asked, why are they doing this? Instead, I laughed. I called them decadent. I called them wasteful. I called them fools. He sat back down, suddenly exhausted. And now, young men are dead, because of my arrogance. Lebedev did not know what to say. In the Soviet system, generals did not admit mistakes. They did not show weakness. They did not question the doctrine. But Volkov was past caring about the system. The system was dying. The empire was dying. And he, Dmitri Volkov, had lived long enough to see his life's work become irrelevant. Captain, he said quietly, I want you to take these reports, all of them. I want you to keep them safe. Because someday someone will need to understand what happened here. Someday someone will ask, how did we lose the Cold War? And the answer will be in these pages. We lost because we stopped innovating. We lost because we believed our own propaganda. We lost because we built a military for the last war, not the next one. Lebedev gathered the folders. Where will you go, Comrade General? Home, Volkov said. To my apartment. To my wife. To try and forget the sound of turrets exploding and the smell of burning diesel. As Lebedev left, Volkov poured one last glass of vodka. He raised it to the empty room. "To the T-72, he said softly. "The finest tank in the world. For exactly 30 years. He drank. The vodka burned. And in that burn, he felt the weight of every decision, every training manual, every confident speech he had ever given. The Americans had not just defeated an army. They had shattered an illusion. The illusion that Soviet doctrine, Soviet technology, and Soviet willpower could overcome any enemy. The television remained off. Volkov did not need to watch anymore. He had seen enough. The future had arrived in the Iraqi desert, riding in American M1 Abrams tanks, flying in AH-64 Apache helicopters, firing AGM-114 Hellfire missiles from distances that should have been impossible. And the past, his past, the Soviet armored doctrine he had helped perfect, was burning on Highway 80. General Dmitri Volkov, tank officer, doctrine writer, trainer of thousands, sat alone in his Moscow office and accepted the one truth he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. The Americans had won. Not just the war in Iraq, not just the battle in the desert. They had won the Cold War, and they had won it with machines that could see in the dark. If you have ever wondered what it feels like when everything you believe turns out to be wrong, when a lifetime of certainty crumbles in a matter of days, ask a Soviet tank commander who watched Desert Storm. The Americans didn't just change the battlefield. They changed the future, and the rest of the world is still catching up.